with that, we're going to move to the next portion of our program, and Chuck will join me here. We're going to take a few minutes to remember a friend and colleague, and I will turn it to Chuck to introduce this session.
Thank you, Rachel. I think most of you know that Dr. Milt Korn, a patron, a friend, a supporter, a colleague in MCBK, passed away at the age of 93 in February. Some of you hearing his age are probably in shock at the moment to know how old Milt was. He was truly a phenomenon, and we are grateful to him for so many things he has done for MCBK and for informatics and for the nation more broadly. So for the next half hour, we are going to be remembering Milt. The remembrance will be in 4 parts. For the first part, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Valerie Florence with us, and I'll introduce Valerie in more detail in a moment. She was Milt's colleague at the National Library of Medicine for several years. In the second part, following Valerie's remarks and remembrance, Rachel will be offering some comments about Milt's support of MCBK, and then that will be followed by some brief remembrances of my own. And then we would like, in the fourth part, to read out some of your remembrances of Milt. So if you would type those starting now, starting any time, into the chat or the Q&A, we will read your remembrances. So I know many of you knew Milt and would like to acknowledge in front of your colleagues your recollections of him. So please, I encourage you to do that anytime starting now, and we'll read them at the end. So let me now introduce Dr. Valerie Florence, who is currently acting scientific director for the National Library of Medicine's Intramural Research Program, where investigators, their staff, and trainees do original research on methods and models in computational biology and computational health. Valerie previously was the Deputy Director of Extramural Programs at the National Library of Medicine, where she was responsible for a platform of grants on advanced research topics in biomedical informatics. We are very pleased that Valerie is here with us today, and Valerie, let me now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Chuck. And I have to say, I'm honored to be here on behalf of our great friend and colleague, Milton Korn. So I want to say a few things about him. And some of these I've drawn from the outside world. Some of them may be reminiscences of my own. Dr. Korn joined the National Library of Medicine in 1990 as Director of Extramural Programs, which means grants, and with responsibility for all aspects of our grant programs. And he remained in that role until 2009, when he went upstairs, as I like to call it, and assumed the position of Deputy Director for Research and Education across NLM, which then meant grants as well as the intramural program. So in that capacity, he was really the principal medical advisor on R&D and medical education priorities for NLM. And he worked for NLM for more than 30 years, up until the time, just a few months before his death. Here's just a little bit of background about him. He was born in Berlin in 1928, and you can do the math and figure out what was going on in Berlin in those years. His family came to the US when he was 6. He grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, got his BS and MD at Yale, and then in 1973, he joined the medical staff at Georgetown University, served as a professor of medicine, acting medical director of the university hospital, and for 4 years as Dean of the School of Medicine, where he pioneered emergency medicine training. So I have a couple, there's a link here, but fortunately for us, in 2014, the University of Minnesota had an interview with him and published the transcript from it. So I wanted to pull some of his own words out to give you some of the sense of who he was. In this case, he's talking about informatics and his awareness that in the early history of the field, and sometimes even now then, but he meant 2014, if you actually attended informatics meetings and listened to what people were talking about, they were talking about tool making. That's what he said. And he said, you know, there was considerable disagreement at that time about whether informatics also included analysis of data or really focused more on the engineering side. And his argument was it was both. Both are really important, as he said, but for someone who actually puts decision support in place, studies it, sees if it actually helps and so on, that is doing informatics. And I think that is perfectly relevant to what you're all talking about. Oops. So here's another comment from him. In this case, he's talking about his own interest in informatics and how he got that way. When he was the dean of the medical school at Georgetown, he was interested in trying to improve education methods. And he said, then if you ever saw any kids playing with a video game, you saw that they were completely entranced and hours would pass as they were spending time with it. So he thought maybe there was some way that this technology could be used for educating people. And at that time at NLM, we had Bill Harless, who was working with the TIME project, which was an early interactive patient simulation. So this was another reason that how we were lucky to get Milton Korn. And the third thing he said that I thought was interesting is he said, ex-deans are treated as sort of like somebody's great-grandfather, so you can do whatever you want. And he said everyone was very nice to him, but he'd already done all that stuff. So one day, Don Lindbergh, the director of NLM at that time, called him and said, why don't you come here and run the grant program and see if you can jazz it up a little bit? I can imagine that's exactly what he said too. And all we're doing now is we're building electronic health record tools. And Milton thought, well, why not have a change in career? And we're all thankful and we all benefited from the fact that he made that decision. So EP is what we call Extramural Programs Division that he came to in 1990. At that time, just a little history for you, the library's overall appropriation for the entire library was about $82 million a year, and the grant program was about $23.5 million of that. Just to compare to 2020, the library's overall appropriation was $457 million roughly, and the EP allocation for grants was about $66.5 million. So you can see that the program blossomed, but that blossoming started with Milton overseeing it. And here's a comment from the very first of his annual reports. If you go to the library's website, you can read every annual report during the time he was the EP director. And I'll say they're much more interesting to read and less bureaucratic than those produced before him or after him. And some of those after him were produced by me, and I admit it, they're not as well written. But he said that our grant programs derive from two different legislative authorities, and the dual basis of funding, as well as the historic mission of the library itself, really helped explain this eclectic variety of funded projects that he then went on to talk about. So just again, summing up, in 1990 when he came, the budget for grants was $23.6 million. There were 112 projects funded that year. 63 were new research, fellowship, or resource grants. In 2009, when he moved upstairs to the deputy director position, The budget was up to 49.6 million, about 174 projects, 77 of which were research grants, and new kinds of projects like the knowledge management planning grants for libraries. In either case, the Center for Scientific Review that reviews grant applications for every other institute in those days didn't really do informatics. So the library also had the responsibility for reviewing its own grants. It now, in 2009, we assessed it was about 80% of the grants that we awarded were actually reviewed by our own study section. Now it's changed, and I think CSR, now that I jokingly will say this, much of NIH has discovered how important informatics is to the science they're interested in. CSR study sections now do much more review, good review, understanding review of informatics. So I want to say just a personal word or two. So Milton hired me in 2000. That's when I joined the extramural programs at NLM. I'd been working at AAMC and I knew him through that because it was a project focused on the library's IAIMS initiative. And I have to say, he was really a marvelous boss, administrator, whatever you'd like to call him. Very personable, always approachable, encouraging new directions, and fostering, and particularly for our staff, encouraging the diversity and inclusion. We had a very diverse group right from the beginning, but that, that can be handled many different ways in different divisions. And ours, we worked really hard to make sure we did things together and communicated with one another, including parties. And Milton attended all the parties that we ever had. And in his role as coordinator of research and education for NLM, I want to say that one of the real values, he of course, shared his medical insight and his knowledge of informatics with others at NIH through the many committees that he participated in as a representative of NLM. But it also worked the other way. He could bring us insights, and he did, of the kinds of things those other institutes were interested in that might have a little window of opportunity for us to collaborate with them. And we did much more of that. So this is just a picture from our goodbye party to him. For him, we gave him a picture of all of us, so we knew he wouldn't forget us, but he was going to a different building, that one behind me, where the rest of us were still out in a leased building somewhere else. And I include this picture because you can see the joy that he expresses. I mean, he was honestly very happy with it and just so delightful. So at the end of his party, we all used the Vulcan hand salute. I know you know what this is. I don't need to explain it. Live long and prosper. And I think you've already heard and can tell that he did exactly that. So in closing, before I hand it back to Chuck, I just want to say that I think, the phrase Renaissance man, in my mind, is always applied to Milton. Aside from his amazing medical knowledge and his scientific knowledge, he had this wide scope of interests, science fiction and the arts and music. He listened to my son's punk band music, right, which I thought was pretty amazing, and shared his passion for other music with me, including a 8 audio tape set that described the Wagner ring cycle in incredible detail and changed my whole way of understanding it and appreciating it too. He did have a sincere interest in others and an inquiring mind always, and a sly sense of humor. There's going to be a little video clip here that will give you a sense of that. And I am going to say goodbye. Thank you for the opportunity, and move you on to the next step.
Thank you, Glenda, and good morning. We're continuing from yesterday, examining broken science. Yesterday, to some extent, was focused, I think, on what's wrong, diagnosis, And of course, most of the speakers, for those of you who were here yesterday, also had an interesting group of suggestions about what we, in fact, might be able to do about it, fixing the Temple of Holy Mother Science.
Thank you, Valerie, for sharing those remarks and for that wonderful clip of Milton. It was great to hear his voice. I want to interject in with just a brief anecdote, and then I will turn this back over to Chuck. I'm saddened that I didn't get to know Milt better, but I learned so much through the preparation that you have done on this, and certainly in these last few years, I have gotten to know him through my work with MCBK. And he was really a legend when I met him, and I was nervous to have met him, but just immediately he just treated me as a colleague, a respected colleague, and was so collaborative and helpful to me and Chuck as we began MCBK and started to plan the course of how to make these meetings, how to grow this community, what kinds of things could we do. He always had a practical and supportive tone, and really had a helpful, just pragmatic desire to help. And I felt that from the moment I first met him and every conversation we had. He helped guide Chuck and I very patiently through all kinds of questions as we moved to our first public meeting about NIH, how to reserve a room, how do we get a sponsor, can we cater food, can we give a sandwich to the government and the NLM employees that we wanted very much to be a part of our group. And these were all big questions that potentially could be showstoppers for some of the meetings that we were planning. And I am sure many of these questions were just tedious, but Milt just patiently and thoughtfully guided us through each and every decision and really tried to save us from going down wrong holes and rabbit holes and things of that nature. So that was really, I'm grateful to have had his support and to have gotten a chance to know him through my collaboration with this effort. I'll say I'll share one quick exchange that he and I had a few years ago, I guess maybe 3 years ago, where I was writing the report for our largest public meeting that we had at NLM, or actually it might have been the NIH one. Many of the co-authors of that paper are work group chairs in attending this meeting. But at any rate, I wanted to give him an acknowledgement for all that he had done to help us. So I shared with him this paper, and we had a couple of conversations by phone and by email. And I'll just preface it with my opening pointed to the very abundant literature about health disparities and opportunities for improving health and just so many things that we could do from a medical perspective and from a public health perspective. And I think I went I skipped a ... and then made a line. So here comes CBK and MCBK, and we are going to solve all these problems. So he called BS on me very clearly, and that was his word. He said, I call BS. And he just showed me a couple of sentences very nicely and very constructively and said, in fact, I think your introductory paragraph, and I quote, has the odor of first paragraph of most grant applications that point to the presence of evil in the universe as the reason for requesting funding. And I just couldn't help but chuckle. And I said, you're right. And we did some reworking. I still have my artistic and grantsmanship roots. So we do have our vision of how we can connect those dots. But his comments, both, in paper and edit form and verbally, really help strengthen my thinking around this. So long story short, the paper goes through and it gets published. And at some point, he sent me just a beautiful, short, thoughtful email, unsolicited, that said, my paper has clarity and fidelity that are in themselves as tribute to your professionalism. And I just thought that was just the most touching and just wonderful thing. I just treasure that and pulled up that email, in fact, as we were remembering him. And so thanks for the opportunity to let me share that story and to continue to honor his legacy as we can. There's so much great work to be done, and he really had clearly insight and vision about what the future is going to be. So I'm glad to have intersected with him in this small way. I know others have commented as well, and so I'm going to turn it over to Chuck to give a few of his remarks, and then we'll open it up to some comments that others in the audience might have.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Valerie, for that excellent summary of Milt and your own reflections, and Rachel, to you as well. I'm sharing one slide. It's not about me in the foreground, but about Milt in the background. This is us on some kind of panel together in some kind of meeting where I'm sure Milt is making one of his famous penetrating and articulate comments. And you see me hanging on his every word, which in fact I always did for good reason. So I just like to offer 5 quick observations about Milt that are personal and a bit from the heart here, and this is going to be hard for me. First of all, it goes without saying that Milt was ageless. He had boundless energy, much more than people a fraction of his age, and enthusiasm and motivation that you would have expected from someone much younger than him. And as I said earlier, most people, when they found out, including myself, when I did, how old Milt was, were very surprised. Second, he was a visionary, truly a visionary. Valerie was speaking to this a bit. And as it relates to MCBK, he saw the potential of MCBK right away. He was kind of the Wayne Gretzky of informatics. He saw where the puck was going to be, and he skated and encouraged us to skate to where that is. Very importantly, he connected MCBK to the NLM, and as Rachel said, he really enabled both by making the general arrangements and then sweating the details around these arrangements, the holding of the first 2 MCBK face-to-face meetings on the NIH campus, the first time in the NLM building itself, and the second time in a conference center across the street from the NLM. We couldn't have done this without Milt and Milt's support. Third, Milt was generous. He could have been the most generous person I've ever known. When you met with him, he didn't want to talk about himself. He wanted to talk about you. He wanted to know what you were interested in, what you were doing, and how he could help you. When I was at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, we ran into an interesting situation where we needed to get a large number of our grant, contract, and cooperative agreement program applications reviewed very quickly. I approached Milt about the extramural programs division of NLM helping us with some very, very important reviews, and Valerie was involved in this as well. And of course, Milt immediately said, "We'll do it, and we'll do it on your timetable. We'll get it done, and we'll get it done well." And of course, they did. Fourth, Milt was iconoclastic. And in some ways, this connected to his sense of humor that I'll close with. But he really cut through the you know what, and got right to the heart of a matter, especially a matter that was bureaucratic. And I remember once when I cautioned him not to do something because this would put us on a slippery slope. And he just looked at me. He actually glared at me. And he basically said, "I never want to hear that word slippery slope again." It's not, only cowardly people worry about being put on a slippery slope. What you should be thinking about is what is the right thing to do in this situation, and that's what you should do, and you should not be worried about being on a slippery slope. And I've never forgotten both that look I got from him and, of course, the advice that was behind that look. Finally, Milt was hilarious. One of the funniest people, and I mean this in reference to his sense of humor, I have ever known. I have seen him cause whole audiences to double over with laughter at his witty turns of phrase, and he did this so many times that I wish I could remember them all. But one that really stands out is when he and I and some others were on a panel together, which was a role play around a faculty meeting where the matter being discussed, it was a faculty meeting of a medical school, and the matter being discussed was whether to invest hundreds, probably tens of millions of dollars then in the purchase of an electronic health record system, and Milt was the chair of surgery. He was playing the role of the chair of surgery, and he was sounding like the chair of surgery. And as his remarks came to a crescendo, he pounded on the table and said, "And the last thing I want to say, and it's the most important thing I want to say, is why I wasn't consulted about this matter before it was brought to this committee." And what I remember is the entire audience falling into paroxysms of laughter, both about what Milt said and the way he said it. So I really want to leave you with my last remark being about Milt's paramount, peerless sense of humor and his ability to turn a phrase spontaneously like the Temple of the Holy Mother of Science. I'm sure he thought of that on the spot. We'll miss you, Milt. So let me now read several of the remembrances we have received from folks participating in the meeting, and thank you for providing these. Bob Greenis wrote, "I will remember Milt for his interest in all of us, our successes and the challenges we faced. He could always be counted on for not only advice, but a witty way of giving it. He was wise, kind, and a great friend." Amen. Harold Lehman, "I remember Milt when he came in 1987 to Stanford for the site visit to Ted's short-lived shop. Ted made sure the carpets were cleaned, our desks were clean, and probably that we had washed behind our ears." Yes. "We got the clear message that Milt's visit was a big deal. And who shows up but this sweet supporting academic with a mischievous glint in his eyes? Over the years, his commitment to the academic integrity of informatics was unstinting, yet always with reality testing and humor. I have always appreciated what he told me about my own work, even when it meant a major course correction. I was sorry to hear that he passed away, but I know that he could look back on life on a life of a great moment, and as the saying goes, well lived." Thank you, Harold. From Peter Emby, "One of my earliest memories of support by a senior leader in informatics was at an AMIA meeting over 20 years ago, where Milt went out of his way to express genuine curiosity and encouragement for my work as a young informatician. It meant so much and always stuck with me. Over the years, I saw him offer that critical encouragement and support for so many others. He was the best of us, a physician scholar whose wisdom, curiosity, integrity, and enthusiasm were unmatched, a great man, life, and legacy." From Jerry Asheroff, "I first met Milt over 30 years ago at NLM during my informatics fellowship, and he struck me immediately as a wise and caring leader. Then, and in many interactions since, he never failed to provide helpful counsel or insights. We actually had a meeting scheduled last year to explore synergies between our respective efforts that was unfortunately canceled due to the illness that took him from us. I will always remember him with great gratitude and fondness." Lisa Ferguson, "Milt was a proponent and supporter of MCBK since early on. As a project manager working with Chuck, Rachel, and the work group co-chairs and many others to plan previous MCBK conferences, I so enjoyed working with Milt. I appreciated his ever-present sense of humor, and he was always so insightful in terms of the content, agenda, and speakers for the conference. As Rachel noted, without him, I'm fairly certain we could not have navigated the nuances of having these early conferences at the NLM." So thank you, everyone, for these remembrances. Thank you again, Valerie. Thank you again, Rachel. And I can only repeat, we will miss Milt so much, but it was a life well lived, and that is something we can take some comfort in.